Well, Europe as a whole is being called out on its response to the migration crisis by one of the world's most prestigious rights groups, Amnesty International, today slamming the European Union's response as shameful. Some member states are facing more criticism than others, however, as Diptyque Laurent reports.
Shameful and lacking leadership. That's how Amnesty International's annual human rights report has described Europe's response to the migrant crisis last year.
The richest bloc in the world, which is Europe, has really not been able to come together and find a sensible, agreed, coherent, safe way in which people can access Europe at a time when they are fleeing from war and persecution. So I would say, on the whole, Europe has failed human rights and failed migrants and refugees.
Hungary was singled out for building a 200-kilometer wall along its border with Serbia and adopting legislation that made it virtually impossible for refugees to claim asylum there. European countries, including the Balkans, Germany, Austria, Sweden and Denmark, were taken to task for closing their borders. The report also criticises Europe's joint action plan signed with Turkey last October, which it says outsourced EU migration controls in exchange for unofficially turning a blind eye to Turkey's growing list of human rights abuses. Amnesty has called for safe legal routes for people to reach Europe and urged the Union to treat refugees on a case-by-case basis. Germany was Europe's only good student, praised for taking in over 1 million refugees last year. But it's a decision that has backfired politically for Chancellor Angela Merkel. Anti-immigrant sentiment is rising. Refugee centres have been regularly targeted in recent weeks, like this one in Saxony. Angela Merkel's policy suffered another setback after numerous sexual assaults and robberies on New Year's Eve in Cologne and other cities were blamed on migrants.
Well, let's explore this further with Marco Perolini from Amnesty International, who's a specialist on the situation here in France in particular. Mr. Perolini, thanks very much for being with us. Now, in terms of the overall migration situation in Europe, it is clear that the response has been far from ideal. However, we have to point out that Europe did take in more than 1 million migrants last year. There have been significant efforts by many countries to give people a new home and help them to claim asylum.
Yes, well, it's true, but overall, Europe failed to ensure that people can actually, in fact, claim the right to asylum. I think that the 1 million figure in Europe should also be compared to what happens elsewhere. So worldwide, we have 19 million refugees, and most of these refugees live outside Europe. We don't have to forget that in countries such as Turkey, for example, there are 2 million Syrian refugees, and in other countries, for example, Jordan or Lebanon, there are more than 1.7 million refugees. So we have to compare the 1 million refugees in Europe, which is in fact the richest political bloc in the world with 500 million inhabitants, with the number of refugees that live elsewhere.
Yes, indeed. And the impact on each country here in Europe, though, is not the same around the bloc. Some of the poorest nations here in Europe are dealing with some of the biggest influxes. No country really seems to be wanting a quota system to share the responsibility around, even within Europe. Are there any solutions that Amnesty International would suggest?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, the burden has been on the countries of first asylum, such as, for example, the countries, in fact, on the border of the EU. And in fact, the EU and also its member states have failed to put in place a system that is inspired by the principle of solidarity, and which would in fact include a permanent system of relocation of refugees. So first of all, the EU and its member states should really make sure that legal and safe routes for refugees are accessible to come to Europe. And secondly, there should be a permanent mechanism to relocate refugees within the European Union. In May and then in September last year, the EU, in fact, adopted agreements about relocation. And according to these agreements, 160,000 refugees should have been relocated from Italy, Greece and Hungary But then the problem is that these agreements, unfortunately, have not been implemented. And nowadays, only a few hundred refugees have, in fact, been relocated from those countries on the borders of the EU.
All right, if we can just move on to another rights issue that has been brought up in recent times. Here in France, we are living under a state of emergency since those deadly attacks in Paris in November. Now, Amnesty has had some words to say about that. The government now says that it's about keeping its people safe in a very dangerous and unpredictable situation.
Yes, keeping people safe is very important. In fact, we do have to remember that public security is, in fact, a legitimate aim under international human rights law in order to, for example, declare a state of emergency if there is a public threat which reaches a very high threshold. Unfortunately, the problem in France is that, first of all, the implementation of the emergency measures have been disproportionate, we have documented recently. And secondly, we had a problem with the extension of the state of emergency. We don't think the government has made the case that extending the state of emergency was absolutely necessary in order to face a situation of public threat that would endanger the life of the nation, which is in fact a human rights, a requirement under human rights law.
All right, thanks very much for giving us those points of view. Marco Perolini from Amnesty International joining us there live.